It's the Steve Padilla Sessions. I'm Kevin Pang from America's Test Kitchen, joined as always by Baxter Holmes, senior national NBA writer for ESPN, Steve Padilla, column one editor for the LA Times, our hero. And this week we're joined by a very special guest, Nathan Fenno, sports enterprise reporter for the LA Times. Nathan, you're joining us this week from a hotel in Omaha, I believe, on assignment.
I am living the glamorous life, or back to living the glamorous life that we all do, and as the world gets back to normal.
You mean Dr. Patrick can't afford you to put you in like a 4-star hotel?
We're very careful with Dr. Patrick's money, as
very,
well.
Very careful, very
careful. And I would just like to emphasize the very careful part of that.
Yes.
Anyway, this week we wanted you to join Nathan because I think, like a lot of us, Baxter and myself included, Steve, even though you don't directly work with him, he's sort of the ghost editor for many of stories that have ran in the LA Times, whether or not Steve is your direct editor or not. Nathan, tell me about your interactions with Steve in the newsroom.
Yeah, so I've been at the Times for, almost 8 years, and I can't remember when Steve and I first started working together, but he sort of has this reputation, sort of a mythical reputation. And
oh, God.
No, it's true. But we sort of covertly started working together on stories just to have a voice, somebody who was not editing me on a regular basis, who could just give me really honest feedback. We could talk about narrative arc and at the core, what is a story actually about? Those really important questions that maybe get lost in the day-to-day business of doing journalism. And our partnership's more out in the open now, and we've collaborated on a number of fun things, but no, it's
we're not meeting in motel rooms to edit anymore. We can be out in public.
But really,
in fact, a story that I know that Nathan was sharing tonight, I remember we did talk about this one because he had a lot to do in a very short period of time. It wasn't a daily, but was darn near close, right?
Yeah, and the story you're talking about there is, it was back in 2018 or so, on a USC football player who he was a star player at USC, and he died on a freeway up in the Los Angeles area. He was just wandering in the freeway and was hit by a car. He was about 30 years old and had a really tough time of it. And so, as we all do, we had aside from the initial news stories, there was maybe 3 or 4 days to figure out what happened in this guy's life and turn around to as good a look as we could do.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that story in a bit here. And of course, I think we're giving a sneak preview of the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is about writing narrative on a tight deadline. So before we get to that, though, Nathan, we all have like our favorites, Steve Padilla lessons. Like, for me, I think it's like, I think about, strong verbs, right? And I think of long and short sentences, the rhythm of sentences, right? Do you have any, Steve Padilla lessons that you carry with you, like as you write on a day-to-day basis?
There's probably 3 of them in various orders of importance. So this is not in any order of importance, but the first is I'd used the word nestled in a story one time, and Steve was kind enough to. We had an extended chat about his feelings about the word nestled, particularly like a village nestled in the mountains or something like that. And I can't see that word in any context now without thinking of Steve. It doesn't matter what it refers to. I immediately have Steve sort of hovering in front of me. The second is we're all familiar with, any disciple of Steve, is the working for a no quote ending. And when we're on deadline, and I think we'll talk about this later, it's easy to go for a quote. And sometimes that's appropriate, but I really appreciate Steve pushing us, really anybody, to do better than that. And the LA Times and so many other publications are full of terrific examples of people who've taken that advice. And the third thing is the idea of figuring out what a story is actually about. And that sounds mind-numbingly simple, but we've all run into that where you start writing and you really don't know what it's about. You really haven't sorted that out with even in your own head, much less your editor. And those sort of clarifying talks with Steve and Lord knows we've had a lot of those over the years.
Mhm.
We all have
Oh,
here. Those are so pivotal, and you know, it's like getting into your car without knowing where you're driving, and you know,
Ooh.
anyway, yeah. So those are three lessons that stick in my mind. I'm curious to hear what from you guys.
Baxter, let's go with you because like I feel like we talk about this every time we meet. We always have these sort of lessons and takeaways that we get from Steve. Any particular one come to mind, Baxter?
I mean, I this carries me still, but I want to drill down to whatever the story is really about. I think a lot of times we can come into a story with a sense of what we think it is, or I mean, we've all had this, and Steve, I know this is probably something you try to tell other editors not to do, but sometimes people can especially editors, but also reporters can come into a story and they think, this is what it's going to be. I'm going to go get this and deliver this because this is what's being asked of me. And Steve has taught me very much to kind of be open to, as much being open to stories, be open to the information and the direction that the story may take to be the best version of itself. And that whatever that is can be not what you necessarily expected, which can be great, but that you're almost trying to search for what, you know, the theme of the story is, you know, and then you drill down even further, like maybe this is a love story, or maybe it's a story about redemption, or maybe it's a story about failure or something like that. So trying to drill down into the heart of what the best story that is there, the truest story that is there, is something that, you know, I think about every day.
Oh, and if I could say, you know, Kevin, for all of you tuning in tonight, or today, you know, you need to know that these three guys here, I mean, they're all awesome reporters. I mean, they're just amazing reporters. And I always like to say to people, let the facts guide you, you know, and whether it's, you know, Baxter, Nathan, or Kevin, you know, I mean, they just get all these great facts. And that's why they're able to achieve, I think, a certain depth in their stories. I think the challenge, though, is when you have so much great stuff, is what do you use, you know, and what does it mean? And you know, we've talked about this before, guys, about like, you know, opening anecdotes. You know, you may have this absolutely terrific anecdote, but does that really convey what the story's about? Should you use it at the opening, or maybe tuck it in the middle, or maybe use it at the end? You know, but it all derives from the reporting, you know. And in fact, it's really weird. I've had people talk to me. Well, I know they're still doing the reporting, and they're like, you know, pitching what the leads are going to be, and I'm like, how can you do that? I mean, it's too soon. It's just too soon.
I can't help but to use a food analogy because I am a food guy now, but it almost feels like, you know, you can be the best chef in the world, but if you only have like top ramen as your ingredients, you can only make top ramen, right? You need to get as much produce and fresh vegetables and, you know, meats. You need to go out shopping, and that's what reporting is.
Exactly. You know, and you don't want like cheap substitutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I do like a good, you know, chicken McNugget from time to time.
Kevin, I want to build off that because you just use what sometimes when I speak to college classes, I use that same thing that you said at the end of every session. I say, I could be the greatest chef in the world, but if I have bad ingredients, I'm not going to be able to make a good meal out of it. Doesn't matter how good of a chef I am. On the other side, someone can be you don't have to be a chef. You could just be a person who knows how to read a recipe. But if you're amazing at getting ingredients, the freshest this, most flavorful that, whatever, you are going to make a better meal than the world's greatest chef who has bad ingredients 1,000 times out of 1,000. There is literally no exception to this rule. It is infinite and ironclad. Mm-hmm. So the best reporting makes the best stories. And that's, you know, if you're a great reporter, I mean, sometimes the information writes itself. Nathan, Kevin, you guys are awesome and are, you know, yeah, if you have great stuff, it's a heck of a lot easier to sit down and write than if you don't. And you could be the world's best wordsmith, but it's not going to make up for bad reporting, bad information.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference in, like, if you're doing a typical, you know, we often do a lot of tragedy stories in journalism. There's a difference between saying, you know, her son's death affected her deeply versus when she heard her son had died, she, you know, had to sit down and, you know, and fanned herself. I mean, you know, It's
there's-
being
yeah.
specific, you know.
Level of
Sure.
details, right. So one thing that I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorites, Steve Lessons, which actually dovetails perfectly into writing narratives on deadline. And
Mhm.
it's, instead of thinking about quotes, capturing dialogue, capturing
Oh yeah.
conversations. And it's all about listening and hearing two people or more than two people talk with each other. And in that back and forth, you can sometimes feel tension rise. You can feel it, you can feel the wheels churning, you can feel the momentum going, and then reporting that out into a dialogue of two people talking. And I think that's one of the easiest ways of, if you want to involve narrative technique in writing on deadline. Steve, can you talk a little bit about why dialogue is so important?
Well, I should quickly mention who taught me that technique. And I wonder actually if Baxter or Nathan has read his book of a very famous magazine writer by the name of Arnold Haino, who wrote A Day in the Bleachers. It was an account of one World Series game. It was the Dodgers playing somebody, a million years ago. And he went to that game and he just described that one game in a book. Anyway, Arnold was a pretty famous magazine writer, and he taught us to use dialogue. And it's like inserting a play or a movie into the middle of your story, and it could be something as simple, even you can use this like on dailies. I mean, you hear the mayor say something, a city councilman replies, and then the mayor says something back, and it's a scene where usually we only quote the comment from the mayor, and so I think capturing bits of dialogue, whether it's a coach with a player, conductor with an orchestra, you see a lot of it can be used effectively in court stories, judges and attorneys and witnesses, that kind of thing. And they can be very simple. You don't even need tape recorders for this. I mean, it's just simple little exchanges. One I always like to cite was I covered this was so fun, a protest at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center here in LA of animal activists. And they got into a fight with the guards, and the chief protester activist was injured. And they called paramedics, and they put a neck brace on him, and they put him on a gurney, and they're starting to wheel him away. And sick journalists humor. Oh, the reason they were protesting was they were accusing the hospital of vivisecting cats. It wasn't, but that was the accusation. Anyway, so they're wheeling him away, and the journalists are all saying they're going to vivisect him. I mean, it was typical sick journalism humor. Anyway, so here was the dialogue I captured. Protester, where are you taking him? Paramedic, Cedars-Sinai. Protester, oh my God. I didn't need a tape recorder to write that down.
Yeah.
And anyway, but my point is, I know I just did voices right now, but the weird thing about dialogue, and I wonder if you guys react to it the way I do. Whenever I read dialogue, I visualize the speakers, even if the writer hasn't described them. It's almost magical that way. Do you guys, is it just me? Or does anyone else react to dialogue that way?
No, I totally get that. And actually, I was just reading a story of yours, Nathan. That's one of the stories that we're going to talk about today, where I can very vividly see the people talking to this father who was protesting at a Penn State football game. So let's talk about this story because it's a dialogue story where one person isn't speaking. The father is just very stoic, standing still beneath his, I think you talked about his eyes beneath his glasses. You can't see what his eyes were speaking. But tell me about reporting that story, Nathan. This was back in 2011 for the Washington Times, right?
Yeah, so this was another lifetime ago, but given the theme of the night, it's something that came to mind. It's only a 800-word story, nothing special, but it's one that really stuck with me. And if any younger writers are listening to this, please take away a lesson from this, that you don't need to be in a press box to find a good story. And the kicker from reporting that one is I was too late to get credentials for the game. That was the first, that was going back to the Jerry Sandusky sex scandal at Penn State, and sort of the time when that all blew up. And this was the first football game at Penn State since those allegations had become public, and I believe Joe Paterno had to resign, and all of that had happened. So I didn't have credentials for the game, and my editor then told me to go find a story. And for all of us, that should kind of, that's sort of terrifying, but also thrilling, because good stories are rarely found in press boxes, as I think we can all attest to. But yeah, so I happened upon this guy outside of the stadium, and just a normal guy, middle-aged guy, holding up a sign saying something to the effect of "they all knew," meaning the administration, Paterno, whoever knew about this alleged sex abuse. And that wasn't so interesting to me as how people reacted to him. It was this beautiful day in this idyllic setting and this really iconic spot for college football. Everybody should have been happy, but people who passed by him just heaped abuse on him, threw stuff at him. He didn't say anything. He didn't respond, didn't really even flinch. People called him every name in the book. And so I just stood there. Frankly, I thought somebody was going to deck him, and I thought it would get violent and, kind of be a sexier story. But it was actually more poignant, and I thought really captured a sort of an attitude, a moment in time, if you will, that at least for me said more than anything that happened inside the stadium could have said. This was the reality. It wasn't some moment of silence or what have you. And at least a small slice of a reality.
And here's one great thing about that story. Well, there are many great things, but one thing I really liked is I could see an editor saying, okay, there's going to be a protest. Go cover the protest. Okay, reporter shows up and there's only one person there. And they said, well, there's no protest. It's just one guy. We can't write about one guy. We need a crowd. And it actually worked better that there wasn't a crowd. But I could imagine some reporters seeing this one dude and just thinking, well, there's no story here.
Yeah.
So that's one of the many cool things about that piece.
One thing I want to say real quick about Nathan and this idea, which I think is really poignant, is I also think you're able to crystallize a lot of complex things and tell it through, as you did, Nathan, one person and the crowd around them. So you're able to kind of there's a word I'm thinking of. Of course, I can't think of it. But you're able to like focus it down and tell the story through like one character of a lot of the complex things that were going on at that time, which I think is great. It's like the fact that you pulled that off and did that is just, it makes it more real in some ways.
Yeah. And I think that's at the heart of what we're all trying to do is we make complicated things simple and approachable. And, we're trying to show instead of tell. I mean, that's just like putting the cookies on the bottom shelf, so to speak. But like Steve, your point about if there were a lot of people there, it sort of would have sucked the power away, and it would have been easier if you write about it at all to just do sort of the routine, very newspapery, 24 people gathered outside of the stadium kind of approach, which we've read that a million times. And
so when you I'm just curious about the editing process. So did you tell your editors what you had, or did you just write it up and turn it in? Then how'd they react? How did that go down?
A lot of time has passed. We're all a lot older than we were in 2011. But as best I can recall, that was I just did it and told them I had a story coming that they'd want to see, and they didn't really edit it. They just put it up, and it took off.
Good.
Great.
Yeah. That's one of the benefits of writing narrative on deadline. It's really because it's on deadline. They don't really have a lot of choice. They have to publish it, right?
If it's a newspaper and they set aside space for you, what are they going to do? Yeah. But anyways, and also I wanted to say something else. So you said that kind of story, if there's just like a protest at 200, we've read that newspaper story 100 times. I think it's one of the things that, we all read Eli Saslow. He tells these stories about really complicated things through one person. It could be the plight of, how there's not enough hospitals, but it's told through one day at one care center in one small town in this place. Or, so many things obviously during the course of the pandemic. It's what it's like for medical workers, but it's told through one nurse at one place or something like that. It's a really marvelous technique. I know Steve is a fan of it, and there's different, I've read plenty of ones that you've worked with different writers on where you're trying to tell the story about immigration, but you're telling it through a blackberry farmer in Georgia or something like that.
But here's the trouble, and I shouldn't say trouble, but the challenge of that kind of piece though, is finding the right person.
Sure.
Because I think there's a tendency to think, okay, who's going to talk to me? And if I want to do a close-up look at a police officer, who's going to let me go on a ride along? You know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing people forget is how much time and reporting is needed to essentially audition your right character.
Yeah.
A few years ago, two staffers at the paper, Javed Kaleem and Irfan Khan, the photographer, Javed's the writer, did an amazingly good piece about Sikh truckers. Back in India, a lot of guys who drive the 18-wheelers are Sikhs, and a lot of them have taken that tradition to the States. And so you have a lot of these truckers who are all Sikhs. And they wrote this terrific piece about this, ran in column 1. And the thing is, they spent, God, how many months? They spent months interviewing guys to find out who would be, well, one who would let them like ride in the cab and go with them, you know, but also just would be articulate and could capture what they needed to say. It wasn't just access, it was, you know, who the character was. And the actual reporting was rather minimal in terms of, I mean, I think they were 3-4 days on the road maybe with the guy, but they spent months, not full time. I mean, they were, you know, doing other stuff too, but months just tracking down the right person. So that's the one thing I just think that's a takeaway is if you are going to, you know, tell it through one person, be careful reporting out the one person.
Right.
You know, and that's what paid off for Javed.
With that story, I mean, the reporting duo had the benefit of having many, many months. With this story that we're talking about of yours, Nathan, you just, I mean, really lucked in on this one guy. And I was wondering if you remember, if not for this specific stories, but in other examples of stories where you have to write narrative on deadline, you know, it seems it's all about the reporting, right? And it's about finding the right scene. And I'm wondering, what was it about that father that you realized there might be, it might be a source of a story, of a focus story there? Was it the fact that there was tension, that people were just like heaping expletives at this guy? Like, what made your spidey senses go up when you saw this guy?
That's a great question. And you know, as I think back to that day, I'd sort of gone into it with you know, a few rough ideas, and one of them was maybe people will protest, and then also mixed with the terror that we all feel of like, is this going to be the time where I don't come through, or I have this tight deadline and this hole to fill, and I'm just going to totally fall on my face, which is great motivation that never really goes away, I think. But there was something, as soon as I saw this guy protesting, there wasn't anybody else who I'd come across protesting, so that in and of itself was unusual. His demeanor was so quiet. I'm still struck by it. And then the anger, the rage, when people were shouting at him or throwing stuff at him, just when I first came upon him, it was so angry, and he was so peaceful yet so resolute. It was just like, you know, the light bulb just went off, and we all kind of have that, like you said, spidey sense, whatever you want to call it, gut instinct. And it was like, you know, what Steve, one of the things you say is a lot of what we do is just what happens next. And I wanted to know what happens next. How does this little mini human drama end, or at least proceed?
Right. So I want to segue that to a story that Baxter wrote. This is about the Celtics forward Jeff Green, and in this story, I guess the arc was he was, after a game, he was trying to find someone. Tell me about that story, Bax, and how you approached that particular piece.
Yeah. So look, as an NBA beat reporter who is covering that team, you're writing game stories every night, every day. You're writing notebooks and off day features, and then you're also writing notebooks on game. So there's a lot of writing, and you know, a lot of the game can dictate things, but I wanted to make things as featurey or as different as I could. So I was often trying to write narratives as game stories, which, you know, some of them probably landed better than others. But anyways, so Jeff Green makes a game-winning shot in Cleveland, and I'm there on press row, or in the press section, and he comes off the court, and I noticed that he came back out, and he embraced this like older white man in a really tight hug. And I was kind of curious and struck by that. And I didn't know what it was. I was just kind of like paying attention. And then I think I saw a tweet, or maybe someone on the team mentioned to me or something that like, oh yeah, that was the doctor who performed open heart surgery on him a year ago. Jeff had like this, I can't remember exactly what the situation was. It was life threatening. So this doctor not only saved his life, but gave him his career back. And a year later, and the surgery was performed in Cleveland at the Cleveland Clinic, a renowned institution. So as Jeff left the court, the doctor was kind of near the tunnel and shouted to him, and Jeff looked back, saw him, and then like the emotion of the moment, whatever. So I was in the locker room and we kind of finished up interviews, but then I turned back to Jeff and I said, hey, the gentleman who you hugged, was that your doctor? And then we just started talking, and I wanted to try to write it in such a way of like, as if I was Jeff in the opening of the story, like he was somewhere in the crowd, because he said something to me about that after the game. Like I knew he was there. I knew he was somewhere watching in the stands. I didn't know where he was sitting, and so I was kind of looking for him all night, and I couldn't find him. And then as I was coming off the court, as fate would have it, making the game-winning shot, he ran into the tunnel, and the guy was right there. And so it was kind of magical and fortuitous and whatnot. And I think, as a lot of us would say, a lot of things happen when you pay attention. Nathan, the gentleman you found, you're paying attention and whatnot. And but yeah, that was one of my I've done a few game stories I look back and kind of proud of, and they're not really so much about the game, and that really wasn't about the game so much as him coming back a year later. But I was able to get that in under the wire at the for the Globe, and under as the presses were rolling, and was happy about that. But
can I mention an interesting structural thing you did in that piece?
Sure.
Okay, so the story opens with the player, wondering, is he here, the doctor? Okay, and we learn this doctor basically saved his life and his career, and then it goes on into the game story, and we learn about the winning shot, and it takes you through the game, and then the very ending is back to him and the doctor greeting each other, right? So it's kind of a sandwich structure. But what's really interesting, Baxter, I don't know if you remember this, in the middle though, you describe what's the player's name again? I'm sorry.
Green? Jeff Green, yeah.
Jeff Green. So you mentioned Green doing something with his body, and you mentioned his torso twisting or something like that. And you mentioned that the torso has this scar from the surgery. And so it's really great because, it's a common thing to do this structure where you start something in a story, you go away from it, you discuss, do the rest of the story, and then you come back to it at the end, kind of a sandwich. And I love it when there's a reminder in the middle of that opening. And that was a real clever way to do it. It was a reference to the body has the scar, which reminded you of the doctor, because by then you hadn't read about the doctor for sevewell paragraphs.
Yeah, it's almost really as if someone kind of like you taught me how to do that. Yeah, well, I remember, covering him, and he still has a very pronounced scar running down the middle of the chest where they, opened him up to try to save his life and whatnot. I
call those echo effects, when you can just remind people of certain things,
Right,
that was just a really clever way to do it.
It's a way that like comedians do, like they'll often do like a callback joke, like 20 minutes later. It's the way some musicians do. They might play a particular riff, and then 10 minutes later you hear that riff or some variation of that. It's a really, really great technique of this time delayed response that I really love, that we can do for writing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Kevin, can I mention, Nathan, hearing you talk about not having the press pass and just, looking, quickly tell you about when I was at the San Diego Union, and on Saturday duty, when you just had to hocus pocus little features, and I was supposed to interview the 103-year-old woman. And the idea was, get her to talk about the old days. Okay, so I go in there thinking that's my mission. And very interestingly, because a lot of, real old people, they remember the past great, and it's the present that's the problem, right? She was the complete opposite. She could talk about what was happening these days, but could not remember the past at all. And And again, I went in there thinking that's supposed to be my story. So I'm kind of panicking. But her grandkids were there and they said, well, you know, Granny, don't you remember the blah? And they told, well, when this happened and the baby in the crib and they're telling these stories. And so what I ended up doing was writing a story that said something like, you know, Sadie Johnson doesn't remember blah, 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 blah. And I share this like anecdote in one sentence. She doesn't remember blah, 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 blah. She doesn't remember blah, 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 but her grandchildren do. And so the whole story was framed around, you know, she's 103. The memory isn't there the way it was, but that's okay because she already did tell them her stories and they remember them and they carry them forward. So it was rather kind of sweet.
Right.
The angle, although one of my writing buddies at the paper, she figured it out when she read it. She said, "Nice save." But she said that story.
Hey, that's a lot of what it is. I mean, you're trying to, you know, make it work somehow. I mean, and look,
Yeah,
and
so
that's a much
let
more,
the facts guide you.
Yeah, exactly. Let the facts guide you. You did it in an artful way.
But
Well
I
done.
was panicked that she didn't remember it. I was like, what do I write about?
So I want to end by talking about this great story that Nathan, you worked on about the former USC football player Kevin Ellison. So this particular story, it's not so much a deadline, although I sort of in modern digital terms, I suppose, having 3.5 days to write it, that's really a luxury in a lifetime. But tell me about that story and how it led to a year-long project with Steve.
Yeah. As earlier this week, as we were talking about deadline kinds of things, this one, it's sort of no, it's not like on a, you know, what Baxter's terrific story was, you know, a hard deadline like that, but it's sort of in that middle ground where it's not a year-long project. You don't have time to polish every sentence, but you know, you just are kind of at an all-out sprint, and it's something kind of an approach I find pretty difficult because you know, you need to deliver 50 inches in 3.5 days and sort of sum up somebody's life. It's a real challenge.
And for the record, 50 column inches, it's such a colloquial term. Would it equates to about how many words, would you say?
Oh God.
1,500 words or something like that?
At least, yeah, at least.
Like 1,500 to 2,000.
It's
Column
probably
inches
around there,
is
yeah.
so it's so archaic. It's almost like horse length in terms of a unit of measurement. But anyway.
Yeah, we talk in inches at the time. So anyway,
Anyway, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, Nathan.
Oh, no. So we did this story, and you know, it was powerful, but you know, we talked earlier about finding the right character, and you know, I for years had wanted to do a broader story looking at I've written a lot about former football players having trouble after they retired and dying tragically, things like that. I'd wanted to follow the brain of one of them as it was donated to science, and their family goes through the whole process as they're waiting for answers as to why their loved one was struggling after football. And after doing this story on Deadline, Steve and I talked with some other editors, and we realized that this was the perfect situation. So yeah, it led to a lot more than a strong deadline piece.
Yeah. Steve, do you have any memories about working on that story with Nathan?
Well, on of both the quick turnaround one as well as the CTE brain one. On the quick turnaround one, there's this incredible anecdote where Ellison, his life is falling apart. You know, his brain is just betraying him, and he sets fire to his apartment. And I think I might be remembering this incorrectly, Nathan. I think we had a discussion. It was so jazzy, we were tempted to have that be the lead, but we decided instead the lead was actually him wandering the freeway and getting hit by a car instead, or a van or whatever it was.
Yeah, it was a minivan.
Yeah, but we were kind of drawn by the fire because it was just so, you know, wild and unexpected and crazy. But actually opening with the death seemed to frame the story better, you know. And then when it does appear, the apartment fire is pretty darn shocking, because he was telling cops like, "I am God" or something like that, or it was really weird.
Yeah, and that was several years before he died, and so he had been struggling for a long time. But I remember we really went back and forth about that top, and I'm glad we settled where we did. It was tough, and it was tough to frankly do tastefully. You know, when you're talking about somebody meeting their end in such a brutal way when they're not in their right mind, you have to walk a very fine line, and we've all had to deal with that.
Kevin, will you allow me to share because since Nathan talked about ending without a quote, what he did at the end of this story about the not the big CTE project, but the one about summing up what had happened to Ellison and everything. And here's the last two graphs. The last job Ellison had involved teaching astronomy to children in an after-school program. He stopped working about a month ago. One of the final assignments Ellison gave the children was to draw a picture of how they imagined the universe looked. He filled the walls of his studio apartment with the glimpses of eternity. That's the end.
Wow.
That's pretty cool, huh?
That's great.
Nathan, now I'm jealous.
Yeah,
that's great.
And I have to say again, we talk about the right subject, and that sounds. If a non-journalist person's listening, I want to be clear that we're not trying to dehumanize or anything like that. That's just sort of the jargon we're using. But the family was so accommodating in the midst of their grief. Kevin's family, and like for that little anecdote, his sister who helped care for him had mentioned that he was teaching astronomy, and we got talking about it, and she mentioned these pictures up on the wall in his room, and so she had gone and actually taken a photo for me of all of them.
Yes.
And I can't remember if we ran out with the story, but it was just so.
We did, and I also remember you sharing that anecdote about, and we were trying to figure out where do we use that? Where does it go? Mm-hmm. And then it seemed to summarize that it was the kind of the end, like literally like worldview,
Awesome.
And also one of the things that was strong about it was here he is trying to give back to kids and work with kids, which was wonderful because he really was a very good-hearted person. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. I want to try to sum all this up here in a nice and pithy way. And we're talking about writing narratives on deadline. I think one of the takeaways is actually, if the biggest takeaway is that it all goes back to good reporting. It all goes back to opening your ears, being present in the moment, just letting things happen to you. Any tips we can add on top of that in terms of how we can find moments of narrative when we're on a very tight deadline?
I'll go first real quick. I think that if you're, I often wanted to stray from the pack and tell something that was more poignant and more human and more real. So I often sought something that was emotionally resonate to a larger audience. But the thing that you need for something like that, and it makes me think of Nathan's story a little bit, is you need a strong character, especially if it's on. You always need a strong character, but you have to find the right one if you're going to do it in a short turn. So there could be a ton of people there, but you really got to seek to do that. It can, in my instance, that story was right in front of me. It was a little bit easy in some ways. Nathan had to kind of search a little bit, but if you can find the right character who can kind of capture what it is you're trying to tell in 800 words or whatever, I think you have a good shot at success. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and I think just to emphasize having curiosity, and that's such a crucial, as simple as it sounds, such a crucial skill for anybody in our business. But to do these kinds of deadlines narratives, I mean, you have to be, that this has to be part of your attitude in life. And I love Baxter in your gamer, how you saw that and you were just curious about that. A lot of people probably saw the same thing and didn't think twice about it. But you have to just have that shape your whole approach to the business. And I think be willing to engage with that human drama, get away from the game, or if you're a sports writer, get away from maybe the result of the city council meeting or what have you, and engage with something that will have some emotional resonance and some broader meaning beyond this happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And then real fast, and then once you get that stuff, just trust good old chronological order.
Yes.
Because all these stories we're talking about, they're very traditional, the great, streets of Laredo, as I often sing, they start with a scene from somewhere in the middle of the narrative to catch you. And then once they grab the reader, then they basically start at the beginning and just go straight through. And so that's allows you to work quickly because the structure is already built for you. Just, that's essentially all three of the stories we've been talking about tonight. Those really did use that formula.
Yeah.
Grab the reader and then just use chronological order.
And one of the stories we're going to drop here, in addition to all the stories that we've talked about tonight in the comment section below, is perhaps the most famous narrative story on Deadline, Jimmy Breslin writing about JFK, the gravedigger. He did not go to
Legendary.
The legendary story. So we'll post that in there. All right, gentlemen, a very insightful conversation as always. Baxter, Steve, always great to have you. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us. Any last words here? We'll give you the last word tonight about words about Steve that perhaps our viewers should know more about.
There's probably weekends where I end up talking to Steve more than my wife when I'm in the middle of a project. And thankfully, both of those people are fine with it. But no, for any journalist out there who's been doing this for really any amount of time, if you find an editor like Steve, don't let him get too far away. They're, what's the cliche, more valuable than gold? Well, an editor like Steve is much more valuable than that. And I don't say that lightly.
Yeah, ditto. All right, guys, Baxter, Nathan, Steve, thanks so much for joining us. As always, you can, we'll link to all our Twitter handles, like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff you do with YouTube. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of the Steve Padilla Sessions. Thanks so much.